Hi, hello, I'm Hal. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about the 8 books in total that I read during February, which I'm aware is more books that I read in January, which is a longer month. I have as Exhibit A. This is my tracker that I do via Storograph, which tracks obviously how many pages I read a day. The middle section of this is when I was reading the 2 Rachel Reid books that I read this month. This is just what happens when I read those books. They're really quick to get through. And then I was also then immediately afterwards on holiday when I was reading the next book, which meant that I was able to read a little bit more. And the spike at the end is that's unrelated. That is something I'm still reading because I fucked up so badly. And I did not have enough days to finish it within the loan period that I had it for if I was only reading 65 pages a day. But that's a different story for next month. I read 8 books in total. 1 of those books I read physically, 4 of those books I read as ebooks, and then 3 of those books I listened to as audiobooks. I do think the first couple of books that I finished were very early finishes, so I read most of them in January. And then in terms of where I got these books from, I got 1 of these books from my physical library, 6 of these books via Libby, and 1 of these books through BarBox, which is a different e-library app, platform situation. So the first book that I ended up finishing in the month of February was Apostles of Mercy by Lindsay Ellis. This is the 3rd and final book within her I think it's New Mima, Axiom's End trilogy. These are alternate history, first contact, sci-fi type books. We're following our main character who in this first book, Cora, she's having just the worst day at work and goes home and it gets even worse when she encounters alien life form in her house. Through a series of events, she ends up basically being the first person to make contact and communicate with these aliens. Well, she's not the first person to make contact with these aliens, but is definitely the first person who's having conversations with these aliens, or this, one alien, and becomes kind of de facto interpreter and an expert on these aliens, and therefore is dragged into the wider political kind of fallout of discovering aliens in the mid-early 2000s, with everything else going on as well. We get a lot of discussions around personhood and citizenship rights and stuff like that going on. Truth is a human right type characters. We have very toxic codependent relationships. The first book is very much a romp. The second book deals a lot more with the mental health fallout. And then this 3rd book, I think, did a really good job about tying everything up. I did enjoy this book much more than the 2nd book in this series. I felt like we get some new perspectives, some new characters. We have some really interesting character journeys, but also don't discount the fact that even though these characters may have thought about things more and moved forward from where they were at the beginning of this book or the series, they do still have moments where they've almost regressed a little bit. This was very much by the time we got to near the end of this book, I was there's no way that we can wrap this up all in a conclusive manner. We have a lot of forces that are quite big and outside of our control, that are this looming future threat, and I was we're not gonna deal with that at all, are we? Yeah, I feel where we wrapped up was at a quite interesting point and leaves a lot of room open for the future. Yeah, I think I would have given this 3 stars if I hadn't read this as an audiobook, because there are a couple of scenes where there's some really interesting sound mixing going on, and I felt the narration was done really well throughout that. So yeah, it was it would have been a 3.5, and I would have rounded, it's a 3.5, I would have rounded down to a 3 if I just read this physically. But I think that the sound mixing in the audiobook bumps it up to kind of overall a 4. I think overall I did really enjoy this book series. I think it does discuss and cover some interesting ideas and topics, and I felt overall that was done pretty well. The next book that I ended up picking up was The Strength of the Few by James Islington. This is the sequel to the The Will of the Many. It's an epic fantasy world, especially in our first book. We're set in like an ancient Rome inspired world. We are following our main character, Diego Orviz, who is like the prince of a kingdom that has been colonized by this greater kind of empire at the center of the world called the Catan Republic. And they have this system of like ceding will or like strength to people like above you on like a very much a pyramid structure. And he starts off very much not wanting to be a part of this system, has made kind of trying to get his own foothold into things that means that he doesn't have to be part of the system. When he gets recruited by a couple of different people, one of them is a Quintus, so someone who's on like the 5th rung within this series, who wants him to go to this specialized military school to like investigate what's going on there. It's on an island, it's completely controlled by religion, and he feels like this was involved in the apparent suicide of his older brother. And also at the same time he gets recruited by a head of like a violent uprising, like revolutionary group as well. And so in that first book we are seeing as Viz gets, you know, trying to be controlled and influenced by this Quintus, by the headmaster of this school, by members of this revolutionary group, to kind of all get them to do what they want for him to do, whilst he's going through this like intense military school as well, and having to try and train and be as good as like the children of the like upper classes within this world. I enjoyed book one. I thought that it was interesting. It was having some interesting ideas about how we look at empire and the like effect that did have on like underlying populace. I think the idea of this pyramid scheme is such a good way to look at how things like the Roman Empire were built on the backs of massive slave empires and the like human costs that accrued. But I felt like the story in itself was a very straightforward, like magical, you know, or military school type fantasy book, and I was very much like, this is interesting. There's some very interesting things that are happening at the end of this book, but I wanted there to be something more from this book, which I did feel like we got in this second book that I was reading. I can't explain this book without majorly spoiling the end of like the previous book. It's very much based on exactly what happened in the end of the book one, but we are introduced to some new perspectives in a very interesting way. We're introduced to some new settings as well. We obviously still have our like ancient Rome inspired world, but we also have one that's a bit more like ancient Egypt inspired, and one that's a bit more like Celtic Druidic as well. And we just kind of really open up the world in this kind of way and experience different like levels of control and authoritarian kind of governments. And this was kind of the thing that I wanted following book one. I really wanted things to kind of open up and get a lot more complicated. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to tie everything together, and I don't feel like all of the politics were 100% as rock solid as they were in book one, but I do think it's very interesting, and that's what I wanted. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I felt like I had a great time. It was a pretty chunky book, but I felt like it was done pretty well, and I was engaged kind of the whole time going through. The next book that I ended up picking up was Hazelthorn by C.G. Drews. I had read another one of their books, Don't Let the Forest In, and it's very much in kind of the same vein. It's like this gay, like botanical horror YA book, but in this one we're following our main character Evander, who is like a young ward in this like very old and slightly decrepit house with this huge garden outside of it. He's been taken in by the grandfather of this family when his parents died in like a car accident, and he has this very tumultuous relationship with the grandfather's like grandson, who is about the same age as Evander, called Laurie. They used to have this friendship, but Evander remembers Laurie trying to bury him alive, and since then they've like not really wanted to or been allowed to very much interact with each other. And yeah, Evander is just kind of like kept in this room. He's had to go through a lot of surgeries and medicine following this event to try and keep him healthy and things like that. And we start off this book with Laurie's come back to the house following the summer, and very soon after that, Evander's guardian dies very suddenly in a way that's quite suspicious. It's being ruled as like just a aneurysm, and obviously there's now turnover because both of these kids are 17. They need a guardian, so other members of this like extended family are coming in, and they all kind of want Hazelthorn to themselves. So what happens when Evander is the person who is named within the will to inherit everything? And yeah, we kind of go from there. We start working out that things aren't quite as they seem. There's something more going on with this house, with this garden. Evander in himself is someone who is very anxious, and so he's very much trying to channel everything that's going on in like, what if I step by step followed the instructions in my like 1800 Victorian detective novels and solve this murder? So that's quite a strong plot point that's kind of running through a lot of this book. He ends up having to work together with Laurie as well, and kind of we're trying to work out what's gone on there, what is the link between these two people, and things get a bit more complicated and stuff from there as well. Like with Don't Let the Forest In, C.G. Drews has a really lovely, like, evocative and florally writing style, which I think blends really well with the type of books that they write, especially within this like botanical like horror things. If you're describing other things with, you know, botanical language, I think it really works. And I also listened to this as an audiobook, like I did with Don't Let the Forest In, and the audiobook narrator for both of these books does a really good job with, like, you know, acting out the level of anxiety that these protagonists have, and having that heighten like everything else that happens in this book, because we're already at such a height with just the like internal monologue and the anxiety that anytime anything that's like spooky or horror kind of happens, it is much more evocative in that way. It was great. I love the like, what if the garden, like, instead of like what if a house was haunted and it loved you, it was like what if the garden was haunted and it loved you. I really enjoyed Laurie's and Amanda's relationship. I thought that was done really well. I do enjoy a relationship that's like just a little bit toxic, and that was definitely the case here. And again, felt like the progression of that was done really well. I did enjoy this ending a lot more than I did for like Don't Let the Forest In, so yeah, I felt like it was on par with everything else. I gave that book 4 stars, but I'm gonna give this book 5 stars just because I felt like everything was tied up a lot better. I enjoyed the plot a little bit more in this one, but yeah, I'm not obsessed with it, but I felt like it was a really well done story, and yeah, just handled really well. The next book that I ended up picking up was Game Changer by Rachel Reid. This is the first book in the Game Changer series, which is mostly interconnected, like, gay hockey romances. And this one we're following Scott and Kip. Scott is the captain of the New York Admirals and like one of the golden boys in hockey. And he is like secretly gay and, you know, hiding this, not doing anything with men whilst he's in America. He goes to Europe and has like flings over the summer kind of thing. So what happens when he runs into Kip, who works at a smoothing bar, and they have this like instant connection and start a relationship. They start hooking up, and then that leads into something more. Kip is obviously, like I mentioned, working at the smoothie bar. He is like a history student and he's wanting to get more into like the museum world of things. I felt like the start of this book was really strong. I really enjoyed the chemistry between these two characters. I thought that was done really well. I then felt like the middle of this book was not good. We kind of get, you know, the first part is really good and we're like connecting these characters, and then the middle part just kind of plateaus in a real way and we just get a lot of sex scenes, which like, there was a little bit of like development in between those, but I felt like did not do a huge amount to move the plot forward. This book's 432 pages long and it did not have to be. And like, I'm not even complaining about the sex scenes in themselves. I think that Rachel Reid's sex scenes are like fine and she writes them quite well. my main issue with her writing is more like the exposition-y parts of it. But like, it was just so long, and then when we get to like, you know, third act breakup and like climax and everything there, I was like, oh god, finally. But like, because the middle part of this was drawn out, it felt like the conversation that they were having at the ends were like, well, you should have had this conversation like 100 or so pages ago. Why are we here at this point? Like, I feel like that's one of the issues that you often get with books that are based off of serialized works, whether fanfiction or not, is that you do sometimes get this like plateau. You know, I'm making assumptions, but sometimes, you know, they don't have the time to write the like next plot fill chapters, so we just get these like interstitial moments, and I felt like it just like the plot and the pace of this ground to a halt in a very real way. Obviously, because Game Changers does have an adaptation in the way of episode 3 of the first season of Heated Rivalry, I did spend the entire time reading this book, comparing the two. I'm not going to talk about that, but I don't know, the next bit of time. Whilst with like Heated Rivalry, I'm absolutely like, I enjoyed the TV show much more than the books. I feel like with Game Changers, there were both like pluses and minuses between the book and the adaptation. I do think in general that Jacob Tinney did a very good job adapting this book. I think he should do whatever he wants for the rest of his life. So like, there is an element of bias here. I liked that with the space that we had in this book, the relationship development that occurs between Scott and Kip is a lot slower, and we have time to build like a sense of domesticity between these two characters, rather than what happens in the TV show, which is, you know, they meet, they go on a couple of like, you know, almost dates, they hook up, and then they start very quickly living together. That is much more drawn out. We get more time of them meeting at various points, a couple of more dates, and more times of them like having sex and developing this relationship before any of the moving in stuff happens. It's not until like Scott is away for a bunch of games that Kip's like moves in and stuff like that, if that makes sense. On the other hand, I enjoyed the third act conflict a lot more on the show than I did in the book. I think this is part of the issue with the slowness of the pace in the middle of the book, is that in the show it's like, oh, these are like adults having this much more adult conversation about where they are currently in their lives and what their plans are kind of moving forward. Whereas in the show, especially because of the amount of time and like the little bits that have happened in between, it is much more of an argument, and I felt like that was a disservice to kind of both of these characters. I feel like that is also something that is added to with the show, with Scott Hunter being a bit more ambiguously older, which makes more sense as to why he's then also more willing to do like a big impact, such as like coming out in the way that he did. It was also crazy to read the Scott Hunter post coming out like award show monologue, because it was like word for word basically the same thing that he says in the show, which makes sense because this is an adaptation and it was a good speech in the book. But I'm just like, what do you mean word for word? I'm just reading what he said on my TV like a month ago. But yeah, overall I really enjoyed it. Like I mentioned, I felt like the first section of this book was much stronger than the rest of it. But it was funny because I had some other friends that have either tried reading this and were reading it at the same time, who had very different experiences to me. Whereas I was sitting there like kicking my feet going, oh, this is fun. They were like having issues with this book, which I think were valid and, you know, worthwhile to talk about. But like, I personally did not have those same issues with this book, so I feel like I overall had a better time. I ended up giving this a 3 just because of the issue that I really had with the pace in the middle of this book. The next book that I ended up picking up then was Tough Guy, also by Rachel Reid, which is book 3 within this series, and in this one we're following Ryan Price and Fabian Sala. Ryan is like a defenseman, and more specifically he's an enforcer, which is the guy whose kind of job it is to get into fights with other people on the ice, whether that's almost preventative to set a mood and kind of be, you know, the big big puffed out bird kind of situation, warning you not to try anything, or in retaliation to something that's happened on the ice. And the thing is that Ryan, this isn't something that Ryan enjoys doing. He's basically this guy who's very big and strong, and knows how to fight, and kind of been pushed into this role by everyone who's ever seen him and the kind of hockey that he plays, where he'd be much more happier just like playing as a normal defenseman and not having to get into fights. And then Fabian is our like non-hockey player in this situation. He is an aspiring musician, and he does not really like hockey. He was brought up within a family that would billet or like house high school age hockey players if they get sent to a team that's far away from where they live, which I'm not going to go into, but it's an insane part of the hockey system in Canada that I have learnt about through being friends with someone who got into hockey before the show, you know? Crazy. And so yeah, he has this experience of all of these very jockey, often homophobic players coming into this house and having this mismatch between his parents really, you know, appreciating the masculinity that they see in these hockey players and not, you know, really accepting the masculinity that Fabian is showing, which, because he's a lot more creative. He's one of those kids that probably everyone like was never in the closet about being gay. He presents in a way that is like, especially as an adult, gender non-conforming and more feminine. So yeah, he's kind of hates these like hockey players due to this experience, apart from one guy who came one year who he actually had a connection with, which was Ryan. So what happens when Ryan gets traded to Toronto and ends up running into Fabian for the first time in many years, and they start hanging out and kind of rekindling this connection and forming a relationship from there. I feel like this is, out of the, you know, the Game Changers books that I've read so far, this is the most competent book that I've read as a romance novel. It's a lot shorter. I think it was about 300, just over 300 pages. And I feel like it was a lot tighter in terms of its structure as like a romance novel. It's hitting all the plot points that I would expect, and within a timeline that makes sense for this type of book. We're getting a little bit of a discussion about masculinity, about like the more negative aspects of hockey as a sport and like, you know, these sports in general. And we're especially exploring that within both of these characters who felt an expectation by society to act and present themselves in a certain way, and one of them has managed to break kind of free of that expectation, but the other one is still in the middle of it, and how they like relate to each other and help each other out. I thought that was done really well. I was also quite cautious about going into this book, which is partially because of the like fuck-ass cover. I don't like the covers of these books in general. I think they're better than the like stock photo half-naked men, but like I think that the Heated Rivalry and the Long Game ones are the only one that I barely tolerate. But like I don't like the cover, and I don't like the implication that this cover set up. And whilst yeah, like it is very much like big burly guy with like softer, more feminine guy, I feel like that was handled in a way that was surprising and well done to me, especially considering that I have issues and I'm uncomfortable with the way that Shane gets described a lot in Heated Rivalry and the Long Game. I ended up quite liking Fabian. I think he's a well done character, and he very much like has his own, like a specific style, and whilst that's not similar to how I present, I felt like that was done quite well. There are a lot of very specific references to very specific makeups that he is wearing, which does date this book in a very specific way, but I feel like that's fun. It makes it a period piece in a way, kind of thing. But yeah, I felt like as well there was some very good conversations going on around sex and attraction that's going on in this book. Ryan is anxious, and he's on an anti-anxiety medication that makes it difficult for him to climax within sex. And whilst most of the sex scenes that we do get in this book between these two characters end with both of them climaxing, it is something that's not just like forgotten by the narrative. There is like a couple of sentences just to be like this isn't solved because they found the right person, which again, I was not aware of this going in, and I was suddenly like, oh no, and actually I thought that it was handled quite well. So yeah, I felt like, again, definitely in terms of like, as a romance novel, I felt like this is the most confident of her books that I've read so far. I just personally did not feel a huge connection to these characters or this relationship in the same way that like I have previously felt connected to like Shane and Ilya or even Scott and Kip, which was a bit of a bummer because I think like otherwise this is just like personally they didn't do it for me, otherwise done quite well. So yeah, I ended up giving this 3 stars as well. The next book that I ended up picking up was Idolfire by Grace Curtis, which this is the book that I read physically. This is a fantasy book. We're set in a world where there's like been a previous like civilization that has now fallen in a very like full of Rome type way. They've left like the impacts of their empire and their civilization kind of littered throughout this, the world. But we are also pulling on some other ancient cultures as well, which makes this quite fun in terms of a setting. And we are following kind of 2 main characters. One of them is Kirby. She comes from a very small town, basically kind of like at the end of the world, from a place called Wall's End, which is, there's basically a break in this big massive wall from a previous civilization, and they have like a little town near there, and the town that she's grown up in, there is like this curse or this illness that affects various people. And part of the reason this is happening is because their goddess was previously stolen by this other civilization, and due to a series of kind of quite tragic events, Kirby ends up setting out on her own to try and kind of get this goddess back and fix what's happened to her town. The other character that we follow is Alea, who is the niece of the ruler in this like city-state that's quite based around knowledge and things like that. And she is desperate to kind of prove herself and potentially become the next ruler following when like her aunt passes away. And she is really desperate to go out on like a quest to basically prove herself, and she gets given this quest, and it's to go to the like ancient abandoned city of this, capital city of this previous civilization, and find something in there. So basically her and Kirby are now like on a trajectory to try and get to the same place and meet each other along the way. And yeah, even though they start off on like different ends in this world, they do end up meeting up with each other and interacting and forming like a pack to try and help each other out and get to where they need to go. And maybe like also falling in love along the way, possibly. So they're traveling, having to interact with various other people, maybe some like feral gods and things like that. As they try and get to where they need to go and complete their various tasks. I felt like this was really well written. I felt like especially the character and the character relationships were really well done. Grace Curtis does a really good job in making us care about some of these characters, at least I felt, very quickly, and therefore having an emotional tie to them when things started to go wrong. And I think that was really well done. I have to admit, various part of this book got me, and I was emotional and crying, and I think that's the mark of this being done really well. I really enjoyed the character arcs that a lot of our characters went through in various different ways. I felt like they were all handled really well. I really enjoyed the world building and some of the conversations that were occurring around like belief in gods and things like that. This ticked a lot of boxes for me, as you might expect. And yeah, I also found it fun when I got to the end of the book and I realised that Grace Curtis is from Newcastle, and I was like, okay. So I saw what you were doing with Wall's End, and I was correct. So yeah, I had a great time with this. It's not like as flashy or as like dramatic or action-packed as a lot of the other books that I tend to read, but I did have a very good time. I ended up giving this 4 stars. The next book that I ended up picking up was the Invocations by Krystal Sutherland. This is like a fantasy horror book. We're following 3 young women whose lives kind of get entangled and meshed together. We're following one of these is Zara, who is basically her older sister was murdered and killed about a year ago, and Zara is like barely holding it together, and she is desperate to try and bring her sister back from the dead, and is very much exploring and trying to get into the occult to try and work out how to do this. We have Jude, who is she's quite rich, she's upper class, but she also has dabbled in magic before and has ended up cursing herself and has this really gross, awful, rotting wound in her leg that she's desperately trying to find someone, a witch, to undo this curse and set her free from this situation. And then finally we have Emma, who is a very talented witch. She's a very talented curse writer, so these people who write these spells or invocations for other women. And basically, as Zara and Jude approach her to try and petition her to try and help them with their various problems, we also start to find out that there is a serial killer kind of on the loose who is specifically targeting Emma's previous clients, and they end up working together to try and work out what's going on there and maybe fix their own problems along the way, and definitely grow closer to each other and things like that. How the system works in this book is that you can basically write these spells, and in doing so you are sacrificing part of your soul to a demon, and then that in return gives you this power. Just as, I don't think I've explained that, but that's kind of what's going on there. I do feel a little bit complicated about this book. I do feel like as a book and as a story, it's very well done. I felt like it was very kind of well paced. I felt like the story was really fun. I really liked the mystery element to this book as they're trying to work out what's going on with this series of killings and things like that. Some of those were more or less, some of the twists and turns were more or less predictable, but I felt like that was also done quite well. I really liked all of these characters, and I felt like the author did a very good job about balancing all the different perspectives between these three characters and making that feel very balanced as a story. However, I have some major issues, especially within the gender politics that are going on in this book. One of the main things in this book is that only women can do magic, can write these invocations and sacrifice their souls to demons in return to power. It's very much like demons won't make deals with men, which is fine, except that there's a one-up line being oh yeah, Emma goes, I've obviously written invocations for trans women before, and I feel like this opened a can of worms, and I have to sit here and have 50 million more questions. Because what are we doing with gender? Is gender something that's innate and never changing? So in that case, would a demon know that you're trans before you do? Would you, as a closeted, not knowing that you're a trans woman, be able to cast magic before you realise that you were a woman? Would you, as a closeted, not understanding that you're trans man, be unable to cast magic because you're actually a man? Is it at the point that you realise that you're trans? And in which case, would there be, a trans man who comes to this realisation later in life that was previously able to cast magic, and then it disappears once he has this realisation and he transitioned? And I'm only considering binary trans folk in that situation. Not to be what about non-binary people, but what about non-binary people? There are people who feel like they're both a man and a woman at the same time. Would they be able to do magic, or would they not because part of their soul is a man? I feel like any time that you're doing gender essentialism, which you are because you're saying that only a gender can do this thing, as soon as you bring in trans people to the equation, you've lost the plot, because you can't trans inclusively do gender essentialism. The difference between a man and a woman is much closer than what you need to be able to do. To do this, there is no real cutoff point if you're including trans people in your world. That was already frustrating enough, because I was thinking about this. As soon as that line was said, I was thinking about this the entire rest of the book. And in the same way, another idea that is in this book from literally chapter 1 is this all men are dangerous and predators kind of idea. when I say that, there is literally a line in chapter 1 which goes along the lines of, all women are afraid of walking alone in the dark. No man has ever been afraid of walking alone in the dark, and that's because all men are predators and all women are prey. Not to be someone who loves nuance always and forever, but I find that statement simply incorrect, because you don't have any nuance in that situation, in that sentence at all. And I'm aware that this book is, and the genre of this book, it is a group of women teaming up together to, stop a serial killer who is specifically targeting women. And it's very girl power, hoorah, kind of that energy. And that also some of these ideas could be, reflective of the trauma that these characters have faced at the hands of men. And that's fine. But again, you've made that statement, and I feel like you have to back that up within your novel, and because you've made such a specific statement in chapter 1, I feel like this is now a theme of your book, and therefore I am going to criticize it slightly. The thing is that I, in general, have issues with this very blanket, simplified idea of all men are bad. All men are dangerous and misogynistic, and this is just part of their nature. Because not only are you very much flattening the way that other things other than gender and sex will impact in the way that someone experiences their life, but also you're doing a huge disservice to everyone in this situation. Yes, the patriarchy in society acts in a way that, often encourages and, allows and doesn't reprimand men from acting in ways that are dangerous and misogynistic, and therefore, they often will act in these ways without impunity. But if you say that that's just part of how they are, you are actually just, discounting the fact that this is an active choice that these men have made, and that is actually worse. It's worse to, do something, even if that's what you've been told, because that's an active choice that you're making, rather than they're just evil in some kind of way. And I felt like that was the idea that this book was promoting over a more nuanced understanding. Secondly, even if we take that as a hypothesis, as an idea that your book is putting forward, there are, approximately 8 male characters in this book that have made more than a line of dialogue that I feel are kind of enough characters to talk about, who do all act in ways that are shitty in, to varying degrees in varying ways. 5 of these men are from the same white, British, upper-class, rich family. And the 6th one is in that same socioeconomic status and involved in this same kind of weird witch hunting group. And I feel like that fundamentally undermines your idea in this book, because you have therefore presented an idea that is much more specific to this specific group rather than a wider reflection on society. I'm so sorry, I just do not fundamentally believe that I have more in common with a rich white British upper class woman than someone who's a man that's within my same social and economic status in a real way. And I do think that there's some very interesting ideas about power and the expectation that these people have in terms about what is owed to them, as a birthright, as something that society has given them, and that is amplified by, the fact that they are men within this world. However, I don't think you can then blanket statement apply that to every single, all men kind of thing. And yeah, it was just really, I was already okay. And then as soon as I realized this, I was oh, okay. Right. Because I feel like you could have done a very interesting critique over power and wealth and expectations, and the ways that the upper classes tend to act with, with this belief that anything that they do will be, accepted, and things like that. But you did make this about gender and not about class, and then made 75% of your male characters upper class, which feels like a real issue here. Like, you either should have made it more about class, or you should have had more characters within a variety of social classes. And even though I feel like more of the female characters are from a variety of social classes, you also need to do that with the men, unfortunately. So yeah, it's difficult because I feel like as a book, as it's written and everything like that, I felt like it was very well done. I felt like the plot was very good. It was very, like, handled very well in terms of having, like, 3 separate perspectives in this book. And I would theoretically, like, rate this, like, 3 stars. Do I personally recommend it? No, not really. I have major issues with how a lot of the ideas in this book have been handled. I just wanted to add, I don't think that every single book that's talking about, like, misogyny and talking negatively around men needs to, like, go into, like, also 5-page of, like, nuanced conversation about how the patriarchy affects men as well, or, like, be full of caveats. I'm just saying that in this book specifically, because this idea is, like, literally like on page 1 in those words, it did mean that I spent the entire time having those thoughts through the book. And again, as someone who really enjoys nuance, and I can't let things go when we get a very simple kind of message being put through, it was really tough for me to not be having these thought processes the entire time that I was reading this book. And that's very much, like, something that I know I struggle with and, like, have issues around, rather than being like, I think every book needs to be like this. And the final book that I ended up picking up was A Mouthful of Dust by Nghi. This is the, like, latest installment in this series of novellas in the Singing Hills cycle, where basically we're following our main character Cleric Chi and their Nexan bird Almost Brilliant in various situations as they kind of travel around the world. And as part of the religious order that they're from, they collect stories from the people in the places that they're visiting. In this book, they're travelling to a place called Baolin, who has previously had this, like, awful famine that happened, and they are collecting stories from various people in this city, and through those stories working out a little bit more about what happened during that famine, and kind of maybe some awful secrets that people are trying to hide, and what happens when those bubble over. This, I felt like, was much more a return to basics, in the way that the main, you know, plot of this is Cleric Chi going out and listening to stories and having those stories be told from various people within this city. I felt like the horror elements were really well executed. It was definitely, like, spooky-ooky in some various places. And I just felt like the story all wrapped up really well and, you know, made you think about famine and the lengths that people are driven to within that situation. Again, as a novella, it's difficult always to describe what this book is about and also, like, review it, but overall I had a good time. I do in general really like this series. I think I've given most of them, like, 3 or 4 stars, and I would give this one, I think, 4 stars as well. I think I've enjoyed it more than the previous couple of installments. So yeah, had a good time with that overall. That's everything that I read in the month of February in terms of what I'm picking up next. I'm currently reading Krystal's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. That's the book that I'm having to read, like, 80 pages of a day so that I can finish it, because it's, like, 1,000 pages. But I am having a good time. And then I'm also listening to Reclaimed by Seth Haddon, which is, like, the 3rd in this series of books set within the same world from him, which I'm very much enjoying as well. I hope that you've had a nice month. I hope that you've read some good books. Bye!